In a previous video, we've seen how we can use some fairly complicated if tests, including the AND operator and the OR operator. And in this video, we're going to see a common use for this if test and also some best practices. And that is validating a string. So in the start of my prompt user method, I'm going to say string name equals enter your name, or let's say prompt for name. So maybe we want a prompt for the username. That's a method I have not yet created. So you see red lines. It's very easy to fix. I'm going to say, well, actually, I just click on the light bulb and create method. That's fine. Okay, now prompt for name. What I'm going to do, I'm going to take, this is the new method I've created. I'm going to say string name equals null. Okay, no, that's okay. Let's say string name equals JOptionPane.showInputDialog. Okay, and I'll say enter, well, I'll just say what is your name? Maybe we want to offer the user a personalized experience. Okay, now what I should do now is say return name. But I do want to show something that's not a best practice, and that's this. Let's do this. If name.length is less than 2, then return null, else return name. Once again, this is not a best practice. You should very rarely return null. What I would do is if the name were less than 2 characters, I would maybe show a confirmation and say, did you enter the right name? Maybe someone has a 1-character name. I guess it's possible. But we shouldn't just return null, because the problem is we're going to end up with a null pointer exception. Let's run back up to where we started this method. String name equals prompt for name. Now up here, let's say validate the name. Okay, if name is empty. Remember that isEmpty method we saw before. So isEmpty says, are there any characters in this string? If name is empty, then I'm going to say JOptionPane.showMessageDialog, and I'm going to say you did not enter a name. Now, another best practice, this validation should really happen where we're prompting for the name. We shouldn't have to do the validation again in a different method. But nonetheless, again, we're trying to show some not best practices and some best practices. Now, I'll put an else part here, and I'll say else, and I'll say JOptionPane.showMessageDialog, and we'll say null, comma, and then we'll say welcome, space, then that overloaded plus operator, name. So some kind of personalization. Okay, save, and let's run the program and see what we get. First, we'll run with some valid input. So what's your name? Brandon. Welcome, Brandon. Okay, now the rest of these boxes I'll just click through. We're not too worried about those anymore. We've already taken a look at those. So there we go. Okay, now let me do this again and ask yourself what's going to happen. When I say, what is your name? I'm going to choose OK. You might think I'm going to get a message next that says you did not enter a name. Okay, if I just leave this blank and choose OK, you might say, OK, name's going to be empty. It's going to come back and say you did not enter a name. But as a matter of fact, that's not what's going to happen. We're going to get an ugly null pointer exception, and that is going to crash our program. I choose OK, and take a look. Exception in thread main, Java lang null pointer exception. Now, why is that? The reason is we have declared a variable, we have declared a variable here called name, but we have never initialized it. When we call prompt for name, we come down here to prompt for name. When I don't enter anything, the length is less than 2 and we return null. What null means is we have a variable and we have not put an object inside of it. If we haven't put an object inside of it, we are not permitted to call a method because there's no object to call the method on. And that gives us a null pointer exception. Okay, so how do we handle this in Java? Well, let's remember our little truth table here that we wrote on the OR operator. With the OR operator, if the left side is true and the right is false, it's going to evaluate to true. If both are true, it evaluates to true. If the left is false and the right is true, it evaluates to true. Now let me ask you this. If the left evaluates to true, do we even need to look at the right? And the answer is we do not. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what's on the right side. As long as the left side is true, it's going to return true. And in Java, this is known as a short circuit operation. Okay? So as soon as we've proven that the left is true, we're not even going to take a look at the right. Let's use this to our advantage. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to use an OR operation in this if test. And I'm going to say if name equal null, or name is empty, you didn't enter a name. This protects us from that null pointer exception, because what's going to happen is we're first going to see is name equal to null. If name is equal to null, then let's skip this and we're just going to come right down here and say you didn't enter a name. Okay? So if name has not been assigned to an object yet, if that variable doesn't have an object in it, we're going to short circuit this operation. We're not even going to look at what's going on the right, and we're going to jump right down to this error message. So in one note, we do use the double equal here because we're actually comparing the object, not the contents of the object, but we're comparing the object itself to null. Okay, so let me go ahead and save. What I meant by that is you don't want to do this. You don't want to do this, name.equals null. And why is that? Because equals is a method. Once again, you can't run a method on a variable that doesn't have an object in it. That would give us the null pointer exception all over again. So when we're checking for null, we have to use the double equal sign, not the dot equals method that we typically do use when we're comparing strings. Okay, anyway, with that subtle change, let's try this program one more time, and let's see if we can get rid of this ugly null pointer exception. I'm going to give it the exact same input. The only difference is I'm taking advantage of that short circuit operation. Okay, right click and run. Make sure I've saved, which I have. Once again, I'm going to enter nothing. You did not enter a name. You see, this time it gave us the prompt that we expected. It didn't crash the program with a null pointer. It gave us the prompt that we expected. Okay, and I'll go ahead and click through this. Not too worried about these. Now, one thing that I do periodically see is people confuse this. Sometimes people will say, okay, people will do it like this. They'll put it in the wrong order. Don't do that. The order here is very important because remember the short circuit. The OR operator is going to evaluate this first. If it's true, it's not even going to look over here. Okay, if this is false, it is going to take a look over here and see if it needs to evaluate the right side operand. The problem is, if name does not have an object in it, if it's a variable that's not holding anything, we're still going to get the null pointer exception over here. So the order of these two is very important. Let's try it this way, and we are expecting to get a null pointer this time. What is your name? I put in nothing. Sure enough, there's our null pointer exception. So when you're validating a string, be sure to check for null first, and then only after you've checked for null, then you're able to check to see if the string has anything inside of it. Okay, just to make sure it still works, let's run again. Okay, what is your name? You did not enter a name, and now we're good. And once again, I'll go ahead and click through all these. Okay, 10,000, and good. Okay, so there we go. Now, what I will do, let me add one more thing here. You might remember there is a trim operation that we can run as well. What trim is going to do is it's going to remove any leading or trailing white space. So let me add this dot trim before we say isEmpty. And what this is going to test for is if I put in a name that is completely just spaces, the trim is going to remove those spaces. However, we do have a valid string because it's not null. I don't know if that makes sense. It probably doesn't. But a string full of spaces is valid, where a string that doesn't have an object in it is null. Okay, those are two different concepts in Java. Let's try this one more time. This time when it says what's your name, I'm just going to hit space a bunch of times, and I'm going to choose OK. You did not enter a name. So you see now, even though I did put in more than 2 characters, the characters that I put in were all just spaces. And the test that I set here, where we trim out the spaces and then we ask if it's empty, that's smart enough to realize that we did put in multiple characters, but all of the characters were spaces. Therefore, it's not a valid name. You did not enter a name. So this is where we tend to see the OR operator, the double equal comparison operator, trim is in and is empty, used very frequently to validate input when using a string. Just one more time, just to make sure I didn't mess up the else part, I'll put in Brandon. Welcome, Brandon. We see that it still jumps to the else part properly if I have put in a name that's greater than 2 characters or greater, and those characters are not spaces. Okay. And finally, we'll just wrap this up with 10,000. All right. So that's string validation. That's a common use of if tests.